Hello all, DJ Sai here, bringing you a new video today. The topic of this video will be how to side deck matchup specifically. This is a viewer requested video. Shout out to Julius hopefully I pronounced that correctly, for the video idea. And I had planned to make a side deck series sometime in the near future, but he sent me a message on Facebook saying, hey, can you make this video? So we're going to oblige that request. And alright, let's get started. So before I get into the explanations, I want to make a distinction clear. I'm making this video about matchup specific side decking, which is the most common way to side deck, meaning you put in cards that are good against the matchup that you're playing against, and you take out cards that are bad against the matchup. That's the basic idea. So there's actually two different, well, there's more than two, but there's two main ways to side deck, and there's matchup specific side decking, and there's conversion side decking. Matchup specific side decking I just mentioned. Conversion side decking is where you actually change your entire deck, and generally all 15 cards of your side deck are meant to switch out with 15 cards in your main deck and actually change the dynamics of your deck and change what your deck does. And generally you're going to side like that every game that you play. After every game one that you play, you're going to side like that regardless of what the matchup is that you're playing against. So I'll make a separate video about that sometime in the future. For now, we haven't seen any conversion side decks, at least any viable ones, in the past couple of formats, past few years even. But I'll still go over it sometime in the near future should it come back again. Alright, so the first point that I wanted to go over, when you're trying to build a side deck for a deck, I have it visible right here, but the first thing you want to do when you're building a side deck is, at least a matchup specific side deck, is you want to figure out what cards are good to counter what matchup, and you want to counter matchups the most effectively. Now, the dynamics of the format will usually dictate how you're going to side deck, because sometimes we have formats where there are 5, 6, 7, 8 viable decks, and siding against all of those decks, at least specifically for all of those decks, can be really difficult, if not impossible, with only a 15 card side deck. However, in a format like we have at the moment, where it's basically just Nekroz, Shoutout, and Burning Abyss as the top 3 decks, clear top 3 decks, you get a little bit more room in order to side a little more specifically for each matchup. So in order to side effectively for a matchup, you want to know what those decks want to do and counter that. You want to know what they do, and the best way to figure out what decks like those do is just to play them or playtest with them to get the ins and outs of what they do. And also when you playtest with those other decks, even if you don't want to play them, you learn the ins and outs of it to the point where you learn how it functions. And you also, when you lose matches, it would be a good idea for you to take down what exactly you lost to so that you can figure out what exactly those decks lose to, especially after game 1 when you're side decking. That's the main way you learn what those decks are weak to, and because of that you can then side deck accordingly with a different deck in order to, and you know, well, when I was playtesting I lost to this a lot, so this is probably a decent side deck card, etc. And more importantly, or maybe more importantly, especially for Nekroz, is know what you lose to specifically. Generally, a lot of the time you're going to be not only side decking for your opponent's deck, but sometimes it's more common to be side decking for their side deck. For example, if you're playing Nekroz, or maybe some other deck like Shoutouts, your opponent will be siding Floodgates against you, not necessarily cards that are specifically going to stop you, but Floodgates that don't let you play the game. And if you just neglect the fact that they're going to be siding cards like that against you, then you're going to be at a huge disadvantage when you don't have MSTs in your deck to get rid of those Floodgates. So it's also really important to understand not only what their decks do and what they lose to, but also what you lose to, and if you're really weak to that, then you not only have to side for the matchup, but you also will have to side for their side deck. And especially in Nekroz, you don't even necessarily side for matchups. You don't really side cards against Burning Abyss like Flying Sea, Ojama Trio, anything like that. All you really side are cards that out their Floodgates, because that's all you really lose to in the end. I apologize if I'm just using Nekroz as a base here, but this is the deck that I'm playing right now, so I have a decent amount of side deck knowledge for it. I'll go through it with a Shoutout deck just as examples as well, but we'll get there. So, okay, that's the first step. You know what cards counter each matchup, and okay, you got an idea of what you want to side for every matchup, and you got everything together in your head. Now you have to trim it down to 15 cards. See, you have like a list of cards next to you of, okay, this deck is weak against this card and this card and this card. Burning Abyss is weak against Maxi, Royal Decree, Denkoseka. But then you have to actually trim it down to a 15 card side deck. And this is why when you're siding, you want to be most, let's say, what's the best word? Most economic with your cards. You have a 15 card pool of your side deck. So you want to pick cards that generally hit more than one matchup if you can. Because if you have a card that you can side against 2 or 3 or 4 matchups, then you're freeing up side deck space by not just siding cards that are specific to one matchup. For example, Ojamatria, that card is specific to only the Burning Abyss matchup. Royal Decree, Denkoseka, those cards are good against, at least when in the terms of Necroz, they're good against Burning Abyss, they're good against Shoutout to a certain extent, they're good against Tellarknights, and most rogue matchups. So those are more effective side deck options because you can side up against more decks, and that frees up side deck space for you maybe to side a little more specifically for a problem matchup so that you don't, side a little extra for that matchup so you don't have to worry about losing to that matchup and giving yourself a better chance of overcoming the bad matchup. Alright, so, okay, you've gone through, you figured out the most optimal way to side deck, you figured out, alright, I have these 15 cards, and I have cards that are matchup specific, and I have cards that cover a wide array of matchups, and I have everything together in my head. Okay, you have the 15 card side deck. Now you have your side deck built, and one of the most important things to note is that your side deck isn't set in stone. You can always change your side deck, and while you're playtesting, you're almost certainly going to be changing your side deck in and out. But having a side deck built initially is good for you to understand. You play at locals and you playtest, and you go over, all right, this side deck card was really good against this matchup. This card was not so well, and you tweak it accordingly. But as a baseline, when you're building your side deck, you want to maintain your deck's ratios. Your side deck should never, unless it's a conversion side deck, but we're not talking about this in this video. But for matchup-specific side decking, your deck should still do the same stuff that your deck did beforehand. You're not actually changing the way your deck works. You're just altering, certain tech cards in your deck, or a few tweaks here and there to make your deck better against another matchup. You're not actually changing your deck. May I repeat that? So your deck's ratios shouldn't change too much. So you should keep in your head, I have this many monsters in my deck, this many spells, this many traps, and you should try and keep that generally the same after you side deck. Not necessarily exactly the same. You don't have to be like, okay, I side out 3 monsters, so I have to put in 3 monsters. It's not a huge strict rule, but it's a good guideline to go over because it's mostly important with the monsters. Because in a deck with not so many monsters, like for example Tellarknights, you don't want to side out monsters and put in spells and traps. Because if you just draw side deck hate and you don't actually draw cards that make your deck work, then your side deck isn't really going to matter. Side decks are meant to augment the plays that your deck makes and make it as optimal as it can be for each matchup. So another thing, like monster spell and traps, those are 3 ratios that I would recommend. The 4th ratio that especially shines in Necroz is the number of normal summons you have in your deck. For example, I have 6 normal summons, and that's pretty much the most that I'm going to want to have. I can go a little bit more than that, but say for example I used to be siding Fire and Ice Hand in this deck, and that was difficult because there was no that's at least 4 or 5 normal summons that I'm putting into my deck, and I don't really have 4 or 5 normal summons that I can take out. At most, I would want to take out 1 Senju, at the very most, and maybe I would touch these. This is a newer list, but so that wasn't necessarily. So that side deck, while it can be effective, it has its merits, but it has a much larger demerit of it adds way too many normal summons to your deck, and if you're one of the weaknesses Necroz has is drawing way too many normal summons as it is, drawing too many of Majus and draw too many Senjus. Because while they're in your hand, if you can't normal summon them, they're not doing anything in your hand. So, monsters, spells, traps, normal summons are the 4 main ratios that you want to maintain as much as you can when you're side decking. Now, going along with that, about wanting your deck to do the same stuff that it already does, is you don't want to side out engine cards. You don't want to side out too many, if any at all. That, engine cards, what I mean is cards that actually make your deck work. Like, for example, in this deck I have Manju, Senju, Brianak, Unicore, the ritual spells, preparation rites, reinforcements, cards like those. Cards that actually get your deck going, get the ball rolling, get you doing what you want to do. You don't want to side too many of those out and put in side deck cards, because generally side deck cards don't have any synergy with your main deck. They, on occasion they do, and those are really good side deck options. Well, it's a little side note. Cards like side deck options that synergize with your deck are extremely strong, but most often they don't, and you can't really blame them for not, because it's kind of taking something out of left field. But if you take out too many engine cards, then it goes along with my earlier example of messing with your deck's ratios, because if you just draw side deck cards but you don't draw cards that allow you to play the game, then you're not going to win. Your side deck cards might slow the opponent down for a bit, and hopefully you can draw into engine cards, but generally you don't want a whole bunch of side deck cards and no way to actually play the game. If you're just setting side deck cards and stopping your opponent from playing, but you're not actually playing and progressing your game state, you won't win. Just flat out. I mean, in certain situations, for example, you might want to side out a Senju to deal with your normal summons. Like, you want to think hand in hand with my deck's ratios and my deck's engine in order to create a more optimal scene for, okay, this is how I want to side deck. But cards in your engine, don't touch them unless you have to. And, this leads into basically, when you're side decking, you don't want to side too many cards. Like, you have to be aware of over side decking. One of the most common mistakes, like the two most common mistakes that newer players make when they're side decking, is first, siding out engine cards, which I just mentioned, and two, siding too many cards for a matchup. I don't think, for most matchups, you don't really want to side more than 6, 7, 8 cards at max. And some matchups, you only have to side 3 or 4 cards, just not necessarily putting in cards that are good against them, but taking out cards that are really bad against those matchups. So it really depends on the matchup and how many cards your deck can allocate, how many cards from your main deck you can allocate in order to add side deck cards, and how many cards you can, by how many cards I allocate, I mean how many cards you can actually take out of your deck in order to put side deck cards in and without messing with the way your deck works. So yeah, definitely beware of oversiding, because if you draw like, drawing a bunch of side deck cards is just as bad, if not worse, than drawing no side deck cards at all, because a handful of side deck cards means your deck's probably not going to be doing anything. You're just going to be setting back row or summoning Thunder King or something, and it's not going to flow well together. Now, I've mentioned a good amount of issues, and these all come together and all basically contribute to one main point that I have. When you have your 15 card side deck, and you've got a side deck together where, okay, my ratios aren't too messed up, I don't have to side out engine cards in order to put these cards in. Now, have this in your mind already, because not only will this help you with side decking in match to prevent you from siding the wrong way, but it will also help you save time when you're side decking so that you don't end up going into time. Know what to side deck in, and not only know what to side into your deck, but know what cards to take out from your deck beforehand. Maybe the day before, a couple of days before the tournament, you're writing out your deck list, and you're being a prepared duelist, and you're thinking about it like, okay, I'm going to side this in for this matchup, and I'm going to take this out. For example, I put in 5 cards for a matchup, and I take 5 cards out. Know exactly in your head what you want. If you have to, write it down or put it in your phone and just look over it for a bit. Maybe make some tweaks here and there as you're thinking about it. Because this will, you'll play against, okay, I'm playing against Burning Abyss, I put these cards in, I take these cards out, bada bing, I'm done side decking. You do have 3 minutes to side deck, generally. That's the guideline for Konami tournaments and most tournaments in general. You have 3 minutes to side deck, but you don't necessarily have to take those full 3 minutes, and it will give you an aura of confidence if you just take, let's say you win game 1, you go to your side deck, you take 5 cards, pull the 5 cards out of your main deck really quickly, and just shuffle them all together, and then be done side decking in 30 seconds. That gives off a very confident aura from yourself, a very confident persona to your opponent. It can be intimidating when your opponent's done side decking in 30 seconds and then they're just staring at you waiting for you to finish side decking. Trust me, it can be beneficial when it comes to mind games. So in conclusion, definitely want, to begin, figure out what cards are good against each matchup, know what decks want to do and what they lose to, and in order to do that, play with those decks, play test with those decks. Like, don't just play test with your deck, play test with other decks. Now that we have Dueling Network, that's a great resource for you to be able to play test with an array of different decks. And more importantly, know what exactly your deck loses to, and in most cases you will have to side for their side deck. Always maintain your deck's ratios as much as possible, so this means monster spells, traps, and normal summons are the 4 most important ratios to consider. don't side out engine cards. Like, don't side out too many, if any at all, if you can prevent it. And in addition, don't side too many cards for a matchup, because if you draw too many side deck cards, it's much worse than drawing no side deck cards at all. And finally, know what to side in beforehand, but also know what to side out for each matchup so that you can side more effectively, prevent miss side decking, and so that you can side much more quickly. So I appreciate you watching this video. I'll have a video about conversion side decks sometime in the near future. And Julius, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section. And if you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, and tell your friends about this channel if they think they might learn something from this. Alright, this is DJ Sai signing out. I appreciate you for joining me.